On a windswept stretch of Levantine coastline in the spring of 332 BCE, Macedonian soldiers stood staring out at the sea. Half a mile offshore, rising straight from the waves, was the city of Tyre. Its double walls gleamed in the sun, 40 meters high in places, rooted in rock and surrounded on all sides by deep water. Behind those walls were Phoenician sailors whose ancestors had ruled the Mediterranean for centuries, and priests who guarded one of the most sacred shrines in the Near East. Above them all flew the banner of the Persian great king. For generations, cities like Tyre had survived by playing empires against one another, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, bending without breaking. But the young king now standing on the shore of the mainland was not like the others. His name was Alexander. Within months, the island that everyone said could not be taken would be smoking ruin, its people dead or sold, its walls shattered. And in capitals across the Persian Empire, from Damascus to Babylon, a realization would begin to spread. This Macedonian was not just another invader to be waited out. He was someone who could not be stopped. When Alexander defeated Darius III at the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE, he did more than beat a Persian army. He split the empire's western territories wide open. The Persian land forces had been thrown back, and the satraps who governed Syria and Phoenicia now faced a choice: resist and be destroyed, or open their gates and hope for mercy. One by one, the great coastal cities that had long served as the backbone of the Persian navy, Byblos, Sidon, Arwad, chose surrender. They sent envoys, handed over their harbors, and pledged their fleets to Alexander. But one city refused to bow. Tyre was different. For centuries, it had been the beating heart of Phoenician trade and seafaring. Carthage, the rising power in the west, was Tyre's own colonial daughter. The Tyrians were rich, proud, and surrounded by sea. Their old mainland quarter had been destroyed long ago. What remained was an island city whose very existence seemed to defy conquest. When Alexander marched south along the coast after Issus, he sent a message to the Tyrians. He did not threaten. Instead, he asked for what sounded like a religious courtesy: permission to enter the city and offer sacrifice in the temple of Melkart, of the city's patron god, whom the Greeks identified with Heracles. On the surface, it was a gesture of piety, but the Tyrian council understood perfectly what it meant. Allowing Alexander to come inside the walls, escorted by his guards, would be more than a religious visit. It would be a public admission that Tyre recognized him as its new overlord. The Tyrians tried to be clever. They replied that they were willing to honor Alexander, but they invited him to sacrifice at a Melkart temple on the mainland, not within their island city. Alexander's answer was blunt. He would offer sacrifice at the god's true sanctuary inside Tyre itself. The correspondence grew colder. The Tyrians quietly expelled his envoys. Some were killed. Months earlier, cities had trembled at the news of Issus. Now, an island of stone and sailors had chosen defiance. Alexander rode back to his camp on the shore and looked out again at the walls. His generals pointed out the obvious. Tyre was an island. Their army had no great fleet at hand. A direct assault from the sea would be suicidal. Most conquerors before him, faced with that view, had done the sensible thing: move on, blockade if possible, and let time, famine, and politics do the work. But Alexander saw something else. If Tyre remained in Persian hands, the great king would still have a base for his navy and a symbol of stubborn resistance at his back. If he left it untouched, other cities might conclude that his victories had limits. The world was watching. Alexander made his choice. If the city would not come to him, he would go to the city. Across the narrow channel of sea, in open view of the defenders, he ordered his engineers to begin doing something no one had ever seriously attempted before. He would build a road across the water. At first, the project seemed almost straightforward. The channel between the mainland and the island was not enormous, a few hundred meters. The water near the shore was shallow. Alexander's men began by driving wooden stakes into the seabed and piling rocks between them, creating a rough spine that reached out from the coast. Behind that, they dumped rubble, broken masonry from the abandoned old Tyrian mainland quarter, and earth. Progress was slow but visible, a grey tongue of stone pushing into the blue. From the walls, the Tyrians watched in disbelief. The Macedonians were trying to turn the sea itself into a causeway. They did not watch for long. As the mole crept closer, Tyrian warships rowed out and began harassing the workers. Archers and slingers rained missiles down from the decks. Men in small boats tried to set fire to wooden scaffolds and towers that protected the laborers. Macedonian soldiers clambered onto the mole's edge with their shields, trying to cover the engineers with a moving wall of bronze. Alexander responded with his own innovations. He built massive wooden towers on the causeway, taller than Tyre's walls, and covered them in rawhide to resist flaming arrows. From their heights, catapults and archers shot back at the defenders. Siege engines that had once been used to batter land walls were now turned toward the sea. The scene on the mole became a daily test of will. Men heaved rocks into the water under a storm of missiles. Others dragged up timbers for reinforcing. Oxen strained in the mud. Every meter gained cost lives. But slowly, the causeway stretched farther out into deeper water. The Tyrians knew that if the mole ever reached the island, their walls would be directly exposed to battering rams. They needed to break this creeping bridge before it became a noose. So they devised something that for a moment looked like it might stop Alexander in his tracks. One morning, as Macedonian workers labored on the newly extended section of the causeway, Tyrian ships slipped out of the harbor. Unlike their usual patrols, this small squadron moved with deliberate calm. 2 old horse transports, converted into floating battering rams, had been stripped down and reinforced. Their holds were packed with brushwood, pitch, and other flammable material. Long booms jutted from their bows. Behind them rode lightly armed galleys, ready to support the attack. The Macedonian lookout on the mole saw them coming. At first, they looked like easy targets, slow, heavy vessels, perfect for catapults and arrows. Men scrambled to man the siege towers and turn the engines. The Tyrians let the wind do the work. As they neared the mole, they turned their burning ships into the wind and current and then abandoned them, rowing back to safety. The abandoned hulks, now lit, were carried straight toward Alexander's masterpiece. The first flaming ships smashed into a cluster of wooden towers at the mole's front. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the fire spread, licking along soaked timbers, catching on ropes and dry planking. The second ship ground up against the first, pouring more fuel into the blaze. The Macedonian soldiers tried desperately to push the burning hulls away with poles and grappling hooks, but the tide drove them back against the works. The rawhide covering the towers smoldered and then ignited. Flame climbed, then leapt from tower to tower. Smoke choked the air. Tyrian archers and slingers, now massed on the walls and on nearby ships, poured a hail of missiles into the crowded, panicked workers. Men flung themselves into the sea to escape the heat. Others were crushed as parts of the causeway collapsed. By nightfall, a great stretch of the mole's forward section was gone, destroyed in hours what had taken weeks to build. The sea hissed and steamed where charred beams sank below the waves. From the island, the Tyrians exulted. For the first time since the siege began, they had not merely endured, but counterattacked. They believed they had shown Alexander the limits of his ambition. For most commanders, this might have been the moment to reconsider. The sea had reclaimed its territory. The defenders still had their ships and their walls. Tyre was exactly what the Phoenicians had always believed it to be, unconquerable from the land. Alexander's reaction was different. He would not abandon the mole. Instead, he would change the entire nature of the war. If the problem was that Tyre controlled the sea, he would take the sea away from Tyre. All along the Levantine coast, the flags had already changed. Sidon, Byblos, Arwad, old rivals and trading partners of Tyre, had surrendered their fleets to him. Until now, those ships had been scattered along the coast, securing harbors and guarding supply routes. Alexander now sent urgent orders. Triremes and heavier vessels were to be gathered, refitted, and concentrated opposite Tyre. Phoenician crews who had once sailed under Persian orders were told, in no uncertain terms, that their loyalty had a new test. Within months, The balance on the water began to shift. Where once Tyre had been the queen of the sea, now the horizon darkened with enemy sails. Dozens of allied Phoenician and Cypriot ships joined the Macedonian squadron. Galleys that had once fought for Persia now flew Alexander's banners. Even Carthage, distant and powerful, could provide no timely help. The Tyrians found themselves staunchly defended by walls and courage, but increasingly alone. Alexander divided his growing fleet. Some ships formed a close blockade around the island, cutting off supply and escape. Others were turned into floating siege platforms, equipped with towers and rams mounted on their decks. The siege that had begun as a land operation was now becoming a combined arms campaign of a kind the ancient world had rarely seen. From the decks of his new armada, Alexander could strike at Tyre from every side. The walls that had loomed invincible now had enemies at their very base. As the months dragged on, the siege tightened. Inside the city, food grew scarcer. Tyrian sailors launched bold night raids, trying to burn enemy ships, cut anchor cables, and break the blockade. Their divers swam under Macedonian hulls to sever moorings. They used the narrowness of the harbors and their intimate knowledge of local currents to launch sudden strikes and then vanish. Outside, on the causeway, the mole was rebuilt, this time broader, more solid, and covered with heavier towers. Across the water, siege ships crept closer to sections of wall that were vulnerable to rams. The channel that had once been Tyre's greatest defense was slowly being turned into a killing ground. Alexander understood that a single approach would not be enough. He ordered simultaneous pressure from both land and sea. Engines on the mole battered one segment of wall, while ships, chained together for stability, pounded another. Archers and slingers on tower decks and parapets traded volleys with defenders who refused to yield even a stone without a fight. Then came the moment every besieged city dreads. After months of hammering, a section of Tyre's southern wall began to buckle. Stones shifted. Cracks widened. Under the blows of the rams, the masonry gave way, and a gap opened above the waves. The defenders rushed to plug it with hastily erected wooden barriers and stationed their best men there, ready to throw back any assault. They knew that if the Macedonians established even a small foothold on the wall, the city could be lost. Alexander prepared a coordinated assault. From the mole, troops would attack the damaged section head-on. At the same time, his best marines and high pacifists, elite infantry, would storm from the sea, using ladders from siege ships to climb at adjacent points. The date is not recorded with the precision of modern battles, but ancient sources agree. When the attack began, it came like a storm. From the causeway, trumpets blared, and Macedonian phalanxes advanced, shields locked under a rain of missiles. From the sea, ships rode in hard under the walls, their crews straining as they fought waves and enemy projectiles. Ladders slammed against stone. Men began to climb. The first waves were thrown back. Ladders were pushed off. Some siege ships drifted away, rudderless, as helmsmen were killed. But Alexander kept the pressure on. He knew that in sieges, attack and morale were often won in inches. At the breached section on the south side, one of his ships managed to get close enough to jam its prow into the gap, providing a precarious bridge. A small group of soldiers scrambled across, clinging to exposed stone as defenders fought to pry them off. For a time, the breach was a deadly seesaw. Macedonians reached the top, only to be driven back. Tyrians, fighting for their homes and families, met them in furious hand-to-hand combat. Finally, enough Macedonian troops forced their way through the gap to form a rough line atop the wall. Once that foothold was gained, the mathematics of battle began to turn. More soldiers followed. The defenders who had been packed along the breached section found themselves pressed back. Other Macedonian units, using ladders from the sea, gained access at nearby points. What had been a solid line of defense became a series of isolated pockets. Tyre's walls had been broken, not completely, not everywhere, but in enough places to change the nature of the battle. The fight shifted from the parapets into the streets. Accounts of what happened next are grim. Alexander's men furious at the length and stubbornness of the resistance and mindful of the cost in lives and time, moved through the city with little mercy. Street by street, they fought Tyrian soldiers, sailors, and sometimes even armed citizens, rooting out resistance in tight alleys and courtyards. Some defenders fled to the royal quarter and to temples, hoping for protection. Others attempted to escape by sea in small boats, only to be intercepted by the surrounding fleet. In the chaos, some ships broke through the blockade, but most did not. By the end of the fighting, thousands of Tyrians lay dead. Ancient sources vary wildly in their numbers, but all agree that the slaughter was heavy. Many more, perhaps tens of thousands, were sold into slavery. Among those captured were foreign envoys and merchants who had been trapped inside when the siege began. Alexander, whose propaganda relied on both terror and calculated clemency, chose to make Tyre an example. According to some accounts, he ordered a line of crucifixions along the shore, using captured defenders as a warning to other cities. The island that had once seemed to float serenely above the sea was now scarred and blackened, its pride broken. From the mainland, soldiers who had once stared in awe at Tyre's walls now looked across a causeway of stone and rubble, a permanent scar on the landscape, a mark that the sea itself had been bent to human will. News of Tyre's fall did not travel with the speed of radio or telegraph, but it spread quickly enough. In city after city, Persian officials and local elites heard the same story. An island fortress, once thought untouchable, had been taken by a young king from the north who refused to accept impossible as an answer. The shock for Persia was not only that Tyre had fallen. Empires lose cities in war. It was how it had fallen. Alexander had not simply waited or negotiated. He had taken an obstacle no land army could cross and turned it into an engineering problem. When his first attempt was burned, he rebuilt, stronger, broader. When he lacked a fleet, he created one by flipping Persia's own allies. When the city tried to hide behind its walls, he attacked those walls from every side at once. For Persian strategists, the message was as clear as it was terrifying. The old assumptions that strong walls, loyal fleets, and time would be enough to stop an invader no longer held. This enemy would dig, build, and innovate his way through every advantage they believed they had. The fall of Tyre opened the route to Egypt, where Alexander would be welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. It gave him complete control of the eastern Mediterranean coast, stripping the great king of one of his last major naval footholds in the west. It also sent a psychological shockwave through Darius's court. If a city like Tyre could be taken, what was truly safe? In the years that followed, Alexander's march would carry him through Gaza, into Egypt, back across the Euphrates, and deep into the heart of the Persian Empire itself. Darius would be defeated again, chased, and ultimately abandoned by his own men. But in a sense, the empire's fate was sealed not only on some distant battlefield of cavalry and chariots, but here, on a stretch of water that no one thought could be bridged. The Siege of Tyre did more than add another conquest to Alexander's list. It shocked Persia into learning that the war they thought they were fighting, a war of fortresses, fleets, and cautious maneuver, had already changed. They were facing a commander who would turn land into sea and sea into land, who would redefine what a siege could be, and who would not stop until the map itself was rewritten. For the people of Tyre, that realization came too late. For Persia, it was the moment they began to understand that Alexander the Great was not simply raiding their empire. He was dismantling it, one impossible city at a time.